Francisco de Miranda is an essential character to explain the independence process of America in the 19th century. But the magnitude of his work not only reaches America, but also Europe, where he developed as an exceptional military man. And he witnessed events that marked a before and after in universal history, such as the case of the French Revolution. However, his life, like that of any other hero, is not without controversy, which to this day are a topic of discussion among historians and those simply interested in the history of Venezuela. Like the famous surrender of Miranda to the Spaniards, which will be analyzed in the last segment of the video. Today we are going to narrate important aspects of the life of the most universal Venezuelan, and we are also going to analyze several very controversial episodes in which he was the protagonist. This is Reinaldo Carrillo from the New Encyclopedia. Remember to follow our Instagram account linked below the video. Before the official birth of the Republic of Venezuela, several rebellions against the Spanish crown had already erupted in the captaincy of Venezuela. The first of these was the unsuccessful rebellion promoted in 1797 by Manuel Gual and José María España, who sought the establishment of a republic in the country. However, the conspiracy had a tragic end for its main participants. From a distance, an eminent Venezuelan was closely observing the situation of his country. He was much older and more experienced than the next patriot officers he would command when he returned to Venezuela. He was a figure distinguished by his merits and his vast knowledge in various areas of knowledge. We're talking about Francisco de Miranda, a man whose last name was already well known in Caracas, Francisco de Miranda. He was born on March 28, 1750, into a modest family and marginalized from the circles of Caracas Creoles. That is, the most affluent class made up of children of Spaniards. In the future, this conflict with the Mantuanos would regain importance at the start of independence. For now, at 20 years old, Miranda left Venezuela to start his military career in Spain at an early age. Sometime after having bought a captain's rank, he requested to his superiors in 1774 an action post that would allow him to deploy his energy and knowledge on the battlefield. Thus, he managed to join as a volunteer in the defense of the city of Melilla against the Muslims, proving to his superiors that he was a bold and brave soldier. While performing his duties as a soldier, little by little, he expanded his knowledge thanks to the acquisition of new books. History, law, literature, and music are just some of the topics that occupied his free time. However, he began to perceive around him an atmosphere of mediocrity and disfavor that blocked his way in the performance of his profession. Within the Spanish army, after several years of ups and downs, in 1780, Miranda joined a military expedition destined to help the English colonies of North America in their fight for independence. And in this expedition, the troops where Miranda was managed to capture important English border posts. And in reward for his conduct in the Battle of Pensacola, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. However, later, due to various problems and misunderstandings that the Caracas native had with the Spanish authorities, he decided to leave the service. The United States was the first country Miranda visited after leaving the Spanish army. During his stay in the newly emancipated country, he had the honor of meeting top-ranking figures of American society, such as George Washington. At this point in life, the precursor of independence continued with his long intellectual and military journey, which would elevate him to international recognition for his eminent services rendered in episodes of great historical significance, such as the French Revolution, where he served for some time as a soldier of the Revolutionary Army. And he also suffered, along with many others, the persecution of the terror regime established shortly after the revolution in 1793. But as vast as his international journey may have been, Miranda never abandoned his view of America. He always kept in his goals the project for which he would dedicate his life, the independence of his homeland. In 1790, he presented his emancipation plan to the British Prime Minister, named William Pitt. His plan, thought out over several years, considered the support of Great Britain to the independence cause as essential. Because Miranda believed that it was the only way to counteract Spain's enormous naval power. For this, the precursor believed it necessary between 12,000 and 15,000 infantry soldiers and 15 ships, which would be provided by Great Britain. And once independence was consolidated, the new state committed to promptly pay for the services rendered and to sign a mutually beneficial trade plan with the British Empire. But these negotiations came to absolutely nothing because it was not convenient for Great Britain for new respectable nations to emerge on any continent. However, Miranda retained the idea of creating a new state called Colombia, which would extend from the Mississippi to Cape Horn, whose political system had to be organized in a mixed form and similar to that of Great Britain, with an emperor or Inca at the head of the executive power and two chambers as the legislative power, one of them elected by popular suffrage. In 1797, we find another attempt by Miranda to start the American Emancipation War that he so longed for. That year, the precursor signed the Paris Pact, an agreement by which Miranda and two other Latin Americans assumed the representation of the Spanish colonies. To officially deal with England, the sending of an expedition to help the Latin Americans declare themselves independent. As you may have noticed, for Francisco de Miranda, foreign support was essential to consolidate the emancipation of the continent. However, it is not true that Miranda was some sort of English puppet, as he always repudiated the idea of serving as an instrument against Spain in favor of any other nation. The illustrious leader always insisted in all his plans that any auxiliary troops that could help him would have to be considered subordinate to the new independent government. Francisco de Miranda's biggest mistake during this stage of his life was trusting in the supposed benevolence of a British Empire that had no interest in consolidating new strong nations and sovereign internationally. In this new stage of his life, Francisco de Miranda decides to take action after many years of planning abroad. In 1805, he arrived in the United States with the sole objective of starting his adventure towards Venezuela from the American coasts. However, he also did not get the help he expected from this country. Neither President Jefferson nor the Secretary of State offered him anything other than simply turning a blind eye to the preparations that Miranda could make on his own. Abandoned and with little more than 2,000 pounds, he simply decided to buy what he could to form his own expedition. His friend William Smith offered to raise $50,000 to help him, and some merchants agreed to give him credit for what was missing. But they managed to acquire very little. They barely had a ship armed with 21 cannons, 2 small boats, less than 600 rifles, some sabers and machetes, and only 200 recruits, with no military experience. The great emancipatory enterprise, for which Miranda calculated as indispensable thousands of well-armed and well-trained infantry soldiers, was reduced to a suicidal attempt against an empire that had almost inexhaustible resources. Before reaching the Venezuelan coasts, the Spanish Coast Guard seized the 2 small vessels, and Miranda had to head to the British Antilles in search of aid. When he finally landed on the coasts of Coro, the entire coastline was deserted. Given the circumstances, Miranda couldn't explore other parts of the country with the small group of foreigners. A few days later, he decided to re-embark and leave, ending his first unsuccessful action in favor of Venezuela's independence. The lack of well-trained and armed soldiers, but above all, the unpopularity of the Mirandina enterprise in Venezuela, condemned the expedition to the most resounding failure. His project completely lacked roots in the country, and it did not arouse even a bit of sympathy among the Caracas Creoles, whom he had to convince if he wanted to start any revolutionary process. Instead of sympathy, Miranda's expedition aroused an implacable reaction in Venezuela. The main neighbors of Caracas contributed 30,000 pesos to put a price on the head of Francisco de Miranda. His portrait and his proclamations were burned by the hand of the executioner in the city's main square, and the clergy classified him as a heretic and an atheist. Miranda's failure in Coro demonstrated that the inhabitants of the captaincy, and above all the high class of society, felt a deep rejection towards the attempts. Who was perceived as a traitor according to the Spanish authorities. But where did so much rejection towards a rebel in this Caracas oligarchy come from, which in the following years would start a revolution against those same authorities? The reason for this rejection towards Francisco de Miranda originates from an old family problem. His father, Don Sebastián de Miranda, was named captain of the White Islanders Company of Caracas in 1764. This appointment caused a great scandal among the Venezuelan aristocracy because Miranda's father belonged to the class known as Blancos de Orilla, a social group that this sort of Creole nobility considered as inferior and unworthy of any control over the offices of the provinces of Venezuela. Despite the Spanish authorities supporting Don Sebastián de Miranda in the problem, he was the target of all kinds of insults and mockery from the Creoles, who classified him in the gatherings and on the streets as mulatto, adventurer, unworthy, and other insults. This controversy, which arose several decades ago within the proud Caracas society, pursued Francisco de Miranda throughout his life. When the Creole upper class in Venezuela initiated the independence process, they did not change their concept about Miranda. They continued to see him as the Frenchified and atheist son of the unworthy mulatto, which was worth it. Both in 1806 and in the First Republic, established in 1811, the most fierce opposition against him, as we are going to see next. The idea that Spain could not continue to dominate its colonies lived in the minds of many important men in society. And these saw in the events that occurred in the metropolis during those years the perfect opportunity to start an independence process in Venezuela. When the Creoles from Caracas received the news that the French troops had managed to conquer Andalusia, they decided to depose the Captain General of Venezuela and create a board in charge of governing the country's affairs, in the name of Fernando VII. However, the members of this new board, born on April 19th of 1810, did not take long to show their true intentions. After urging the other town councils of neighboring provinces to rise up in the same way, the new Supreme Board of Caracas immediately sought help to survive any aggression. And in order to request protection abroad, the board accredited its first diplomatic agents to then Lieutenant Colonel Simón Bolívar. Along with Andrés Bello and Luis López Méndez, they were entrusted with the mission of traveling to London to manage before the government of His British Majesty the mediation so that the independence and the Spanish Regency would treat each other as equals, as well as to inform them about the events of April 19th. This was the first diplomatic mission accredited by Spanish America to the European courts in all of history. However, the British Empire showed no support for the cause of independence, beyond assuming a certain neutrality. England was more interested in preserving the alliance it had at that time with Spain against the threat of Napoleon Bonaparte's France. During this trip, an even more momentous scene occurred than the futile attempt by Venezuelan diplomats to get help from Great Britain. We're talking about the meeting between Francisco de Miranda and Simón Bolívar, who would later be remembered as the precursor and the liberator respectively. Despite the hostility that still existed in Caracas against Miranda, Bolívar had a deep admiration for him and knew all his military merits. However, when they finally met, Bolívar realized that the universal Venezuelan he so admired now felt a lot of distrust and pessimism about the emancipation project of his country. Bolívar strove to convince Miranda that the conditions for rebellion now did exist in America, and that all that was missing was a prestigious leader to take the first step towards independence. Miranda responded by showing him that the continent did not want freedom, that the popular classes, as he had found out in his failed expedition, were loyal to Spain. And only in the narrow circle of a small oligarchy of discontented, wealthy landowners did revolutionary intentions exist. That for this reason, nothing was as important as obtaining the protection of the English government. But finally, Bolivar, with his great persuasive ability, managed to convince Miranda to join the venture, and both finally returned to Venezuela by different routes. By the end of 1810, neither Bolivar nor anyone else could imagine the bitter way in which this new adventure for Miranda would end. When Francisco de Miranda arrived in Venezuela, the people of La Guaira acclaimed him, and Simón Bolívar hosted him in his home without hesitation. That warm reception in his homeland, coupled with the country's political situation, rekindled in him the lost hopes for change. But to climb the national hierarchy, he now had to face the old problem of personal feuds with members of the Venezuelan upper class, which was the class that now sponsored the revolutionary process. The one in charge of cooling down as much as possible the remaining resentment against Miranda in Caracas society before his arrival in Venezuela was Simón Bolívar, who sought to create a public opinion favorable to the precursor. Through the patriotic society, using his talent as a young orator, this patriotic society, created to debate and act on the problems of Venezuela, was made up of various personalities from the Caracas aristocracy. And over time, it became a center of great political activity, bringing together different social classes and openly promoting the definitive break with Spain. It was this platform where Bolívar attended to defend Miranda. Standing out as an honest admirer of his work, the future liberator spoke with emotion about all the military merits of the precursor, of the experience that few had, and of his glorious history, and of all that the emancipatory cause of America owed him for his actions. In this way, Bolívar positively influenced the opinion about Miranda of the Supreme Board of Caracas, ensuring that they did not object to the precursor's request for a passport to return to Venezuela. With a revolutionary Bolívar and a veteran Miranda there in Venezuela, the revolutionary process was advancing rapidly. On March 2, 1811, the first Venezuelan Congress met with representatives from the province of Cumaná, Barcelona, Mérida, Trujillo, Margarita, and Caracas. In this Congress, Miranda obtained a seat for the province of Barcelona, and despite the opposition of some who wished to remain loyal to Fernando VII, the opinion in favor of definitive emancipation prevailed in the debates in the Venezuelan Congress and in patriotic society. On the eve of the proclamation of independence, when doubts and hesitation still reigned, a specific speech ignited even more the revolutionary flame among the spectators. It was the famous speech of the Patriotic Society of Simón Bolívar, who expressed in very eloquent words the need to abandon apathy and to definitively lay the cornerstone of South American freedom. The Congress of Venezuela, hearing the sentiments of the Patriotic Society, set July 5, 1811 as the date on which this momentous decision was to be put to a vote, resulting in the proclamation of absolute national independence. The 14th of the same month, the Solemn Act of Independence was published. And for the first time in Caracas, the tricolor flag conceived by Francisco de Miranda was raised. Thus, Venezuela became the first of all the former colonies of Spain to become a free, sovereign, and independent nation. And its example, as the national anthem says, spread rapidly throughout the continent. However, as Venezuela moved towards the consolidation of its independence, numerous problems arose in the country. The first of these, germinated even before the proclamation of July 5th, was the indomitable federalist tendency of Venezuelan legislators, a tendency that Miranda and Bolívar tried in vain to combat from their respective positions in Congress. And in the Patriotic Society, warning about the dangers of adopting a federal system in a country like Venezuela, but both were not heard. And on the 21st of December 1811, Congress sanctioned the Constitution, according to which, as Bolivar explained later, each province was governed independently and each city claimed equal powers. In addition, the government established during the First Republic was a triumvirate whose members alternated in power every month. This constitution and the anarchic political system that governed the country condemned the First Republic to a resounding failure. Because its decentralizing tendency, instead of helping, hindered stabilization. The organization and defense of the Republic, which demanded drastic and quick measures to address the problems that constantly arose, like the fierce advance of the royalist forces that were against independence. This system, practically copied from the American system, did not correspond to the social reality of the country. A second problem, as serious as the first, was the character of Francisco de Miranda, to whom command of the Patriot Army was granted. We consider this a problem as serious as the adopted political system, because Miranda's flaws influenced the decisions he would make. After they resulted in his surrender to the Spanish authorities and directly affected the country. But the issue of his pessimism and his distrust of Venezuelans we will address later. As the narration continues, it is important to note a significant event for the Emancipating Company. The earthquake of March 26, 1812, whose destruction affected almost exclusively the cities dominated by the Patriots. The material damages, coupled with the defeats of the Patriot Army, led Miranda to make some important changes months before the definitive fall of the First Republic. One of those momentous decisions was to appoint Simón Bolívar as the political and military commander of Puerto Cabello. In this square, several detained Spaniards were imprisoned who had active communication with the outside of the place. And the conditions of the square? The conditions in Puerto Cabello were unfavorable for Bolívar, as most of the population supported the royalist cause at the time. A break in these circumstances was imminent and finally occurred on June 30th. A traitorous lieutenant who was in the ranks of the Patriot cause, named Francisco Fernández Vinoni, to Codillo, to the garrison, he raised a red flag demonstrating loyalty to the king and opened rifle and cannon fire on the square. Bolívar did everything possible for 7 days to recover Puerto Cabello, but his attempts were in vain. When he withdrew after fighting tirelessly, only 40 men remained by his side. Having lost the city, Bolívar communicated to Miranda what had happened, and he expressed the deep sadness he felt about it. Upon receiving the news, Miranda exclaimed with a bitter and dramatic tone that Venezuela is wounded in the heart. For Bolívar's detractors, he was responsible for the fall of the First Republic, because, according to them, the square of Puerto Cabello was the center of Miranda's military strategy. This is what they base on to blame the future liberator for the unfortunate events that would come. However, Puerto Cabello did not have the exaggerated importance that has been intended to give it over time. As the historian Indalecio León K. Bano explained very well, if Miranda had thought that that place was totally indispensable, he would have done something to help Bolívar, but the opposite happened. On the one hand, no. He took no measures to help Bolívar, and on the other hand, he rather tried to take advantage of this event to convince his troops that it no longer made sense to continue the fight, and that an armistice should be sought to stop the bloodshed. In short, Miranda used the loss of Puerto Cabello as a pretext to justify the abandonment of the Patriot cause. But in his decision, in reality, lay the distrust and fatigue he felt for that cause. Since Miranda arrived in Venezuela, who had been fighting for decades alongside the most prestigious armies and maintained friendships with the high political spheres of Europe, Miranda found a patriotic cause poorly organized and inexperienced, which before instilling in his person the spirit of the young adventurer who wants to build against adversity. Rather, it produced the disillusionment of the older man, who only sees reality with a demotivating harshness. Another example of Miranda's defeatist spirit was the occupation of Valencia by the royalist General Monteverde in May of that same year. When Bolivar had just been named commander of the fort at Puerto Cabello, which was only a few kilometers from Valencia, Monteverde had managed to dominate the city without much resistance. Confronted with this new royalist advance, Francisco de Miranda responded with another misstep. Instead of deploying his numerically superior and better equipped forces, he decided once again to adopt a defensive stance. He preferred not to attack and retreated towards victory. Many people, including Bolivar, believed that it was entirely possible to continue the independence struggle and considered, with much justification, that the loss of Puerto Cabello did not mean the definitive defeat of the army. But as we have already seen, Miranda took it in a very different way. He took advantage of the forces he had left, which were not few, to enter into negotiations with Monteverde and managed to agree with the army. Royalist, a capitulation that established that the persons and properties of all patriots would be respected, that no one could be arrested or judged, and that a passport would be given to all those who wanted to leave the country. This treaty was signed on July 25th at the San Mateo headquarters, 5 days later on July 30th. Miranda arrived at La Guaira to embark overseas. The news that Miranda was preparing to leave the country caused a general state of alarm among the patriots gathered in La Guaira. On one hand, it reflected a lack of confidence that the Spaniards would respect what was agreed upon, and on the other, the belief that the capitulation had been a betrayal. It was gaining more strength among them. It is in this context that, in the early hours of that same night, a group of subordinates decided to arrest Miranda. Although Bolivar was a participant in this event because he was the one who carried out the arrest, the person responsible for handing Francisco to Miranda, the royalist, was Colonel Manuel María de las Casas, the military commander of the Plaza de la Guaira, who, initially part of the independence movement, was the one who handed over his former patriot general and with him also handed over the Plaza de la Guaira to the authorities. Royalists? There is no doubt that Manuel María de las Casas was the real traitor of the night, as he then remained among the Spaniards for the rest of the war. The case of Simon Bolivar differs greatly. What drove Bolivar to participate in the arrest of Miranda? It was the transition from great admiration to great astonishment and annoyance at the capitulation, as well as the desire to hold his leader accountable for his behavior during the last days of the First Republic, the eagerness to hand him over to the Spaniards. Let's not forget in this dramatic scenario that Bolivar was responsible for involving Miranda in the saga, which increased his sense of despair. In fact, when the authors of the arrest met a few hours earlier, Bolivar did not propose to hand Miranda over to the authorities. Royalists commanded to shoot him immediately for reasons we will mention. It was Manuel María de las Casas who decided that in his capacity as commander of La Guaira, he would hand the prisoner over to the royalist authorities. The common interpretation of the events that point to Simón Bolívar as a traitor and the true responsible for the fall of the First Republic is false. As for the events in La Guaira, it is already clear what role he played that night. And what if it's true that shooting Miranda would have been imprudent? Didn't he have a good reason to propose it? Because a general who surrenders his army without firing a single shot and then plans to escape deserves the collective claim of his soldiers. Bolivar was also not wrong to question the surrender signed by his boss. It made no sense to reach an agreement with the Spaniards and hastily leave the country. Because then how was it ensured that the points agreed upon by both parties would be fulfilled? In conclusion, Bolivar's behavior that night was consistent with the natural behavior that any soldier committed to the cause would have had. As for the First Republic, we already explained that an important reason for its fall was the political system adopted by Venezuelan legislators, added to the administrative disorder of the army and the country's finances. But another factor that did not help at all with the sustainability of independence was the character of Francisco de Miranda at that time. the distrust and pessimism that always accompanied Miranda throughout the development of the First Republic was a product of the Generalissimo's profound ignorance of the reality of Venezuela. So vast and universal was his work that he was a foreigner in his own country. He had detached himself from the social reality of his land. His exotic manners were strange to the Creoles, and, as if that were not enough, he was always haunted by the shadow of his father's conflict with his social class. And militarily, he also couldn't offer much to the American emancipation. His glorious service record had been years without adding a new victory. Before arriving in Venezuela in 1810, he had been years without commanding troops and those he had to command in his homeland. They were not professional European soldiers, but poor, inexperienced militias who did not know the French words he sometimes pronounced. Miranda, as soon as he assumed the leadership of the army, quickly showed signs of the fatal pessimism that dominated him. Once, when he saw parades without order or martiality, crowds of poorly armed and even worse disciplined civilians, he asked the officials who accompanied him with bitterness, where were the armies that a general of his prestige could take to battle without compromising his dignity? From the first moment, he was dominated by contempt for the forces whose command had just been entrusted to him, and thus every struggle is destined to fail. After being handed over to the Spanish authorities, he was transferred to Spain, where he would die in 1816 at the age of 66 from a stroke. Miranda was buried in a common grave, so to this day his remains remain unrecognized. Such was the tragic end of the universal Venezuelan, who dedicated his life to the freedom of his homeland and the independence of Venezuela. Did a near future await him? Equally tragic with the terror instilled by Monteverde and Boves after the violation of the capitulation confirmed in San Mateo. Despite all this, the efforts of the precursor of independence would not be buried. What many years ago began as an idea that had only materialized in an adventurous expedition was consolidated in posterity with the consecration of the sovereignty of the American nations. Thanks for watching. To support us, follow our Instagram account, The New Encyclopedia. I also invite you to watch our videos related to this topic. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, like, and share this material. See you next time.